my pleasure to introduce Courtney Kennedy to you, if she needs an introduction at all. She will be presenting our secondary plenary talk, giving rare populations a voice in public opinion research. So following the morning talk that we've seen. Dr. Kennedy is Vice President of Methods and Innovation at Pew Research Center. Her team is responsible for the design of the center's US surveys and maintenance of the American Trend Panel. Courtney Kennedy conducts experimental research to improve the accuracy of opinion polls. Her research focuses on non-response, weighting, modes of administration, and sampling frames. She published a lot. In POQ, in the Journal of Statistics and Methodology, the Journal of Statistics, you will find her in many places. But what's really impressive is that Courtney is really working constantly for and with the community. And she co-authored 5 task force reports from the American Association for Public Opinion Research. Those can be all read online and downloaded for free. I recommend anyone who's interested in measurement. And she chaired one of them, which was the evaluation of the polling in the 2016 presidential election. Prior to joining Pew Research Center, Courtney served as Vice President of the Advanced Methods Group at SRBI. And she served there, in various roles, but she also worked as a statistical consultant for the Census Bureau. We have many of them here, and the National Academies panels also drew on her expertise. But we as JPSM are proud to call her an alumni of pretty much any program offering that we have. And so, Courtney, wonderful to have you back on campus. There you are. Thank you for the kind words, Krausa. Well, it's a huge pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm going to try to bring the energy after lunch, get us going. I'm actually really thrilled about the timing of the program. And by that I mean, what I'm going to talk about is going to try to build a little bit on what Professor Shilley just talked about to kick us off. And then also you're going to hear some of the themes that are similar to what Professor Wilson was talking about as well. And I'm always energized when I attend an event that's pitched as about the future of surveys, of research, of measurement, because I think it really opens the doors to focus on what's most important. What do we see going on today that really is an important trend and not just a little passing fad? So I'm going to try to focus on that, and I'm going to try to do that sort of through the lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, and how I see that playing out in the survey research field, in polling in particular. So I'm really going to talk about 4 trends that I see going into the future, 4 of which I think are very positive, and then 4 things that are more challenges, maybe negative trends. And I didn't know Frauke was going to give such an elaborate introduction, so I won't belabor this. I did want to, though, just kind of explain my perspective to this conversation, where I'm coming from. And the thing that I point out is that a lot of you guys are in the academy or in the tech industry, and that's fabulous. My perspective is coming from the polling industry. After I graduated from the survey methods programs at Maryland, Michigan, I've really spent most of my career doing public opinion polling through a national lens. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with my remarks. Okay, so to jump in, one trend that I'm seeing in survey research is towards more oversampling of underrepresented populations. Now, sometimes those populations could be defined in terms of race or ethnicity or religion, but not always. It could be some other focus. And by oversample, most of you guys probably know, but just so everyone is on the same page, By oversample, I just mean that you do a lot more interviews with a particular group than you normally would, and you do that purposefully. And I want to be clear, like, oversampling is not new, far from it. Folks in our field have been doing oversampling for decades, but I really have noticed in recent years an increase in the usage of this and people building this sort of thing into their designs to try to make their work more relevant to the conversations that are happening today. Why is that? Because the sort of point of the round, you know, the way that polling was done for decades and decades, really like a half century, was just a simple cross-section of the U.S. public, right? If you were a pollster, you'd go out and interview 1,000 Americans, and you'd want that 1,000 of Americans to be as representative as you could possibly make it. And there's a certain logic to that, right? We do get some useful information from that type of cross-section. But it has a real limitation, because just numerically, that type of cross-section design is going to favor the groups that are more populous, the larger groups in your population. And it's going to leave you with very little, if any, analytic reporting power with smaller groups. And so that's why oversampling is really growing in usage. And just to put some numbers around this for you, what I'm showing you here is what you'd get if I were to go out today and interview, say, 1,500 Americans in a cross-sectional sample. We'd have plenty of, through a religious lens, if we asked about religious affiliation, plenty of Protestants that can report those numbers, religiously unaffiliated, no problem, Catholics, plenty of cases. I would not be able to tell you anything about the attitudes and experiences, though, of Jewish Americans, or Muslim Americans, for example. So that cross-sectional tool, is limited because we run out of sample sizes for smaller cases. We look at race and ethnicity, plenty large sample size for white Americans, probably reportable for Black adults, but honestly not as good of a sample as one would ideally like. Similar with Hispanic, Latinos. Asian Americans generally not being reportable. And so for years when people in the Asian American community read reports put out by Pew, put out by others in the polling field, they felt like we are just completely invisible in your reporting. Where are the views and experiences of our population? And they weren't there because we've just continually been using a cross-sectional tool to do this type of work. So, when I say I'm seeing a change, I'm going to give you some concrete examples of what I mean. If you were reading the New York Times in the last week, you would see that their chief political correspondent, Nate Cohen, he said, we just did our first ever oversample of Latino voters in a New York Times poll, at least under sort of the new regime that's been there for 5 to 10 years. So the New York Times just did an oversample with the Latino population. Now they did that because they want to better understand the Latino vote. How are Latinos, thinking about candidates and issues heading into this midterm election? So they did several hundred more interviews with that population than they used to in the past. And I can really give a shout out, highlight a lot of different organizations across the public opinion field. I'll just give you one more example. Another place that comes like top to my mind when I think about this is Kaiser Family Foundation. They have a pretty rich history of doing designs that speak to a lot of diverse subgroups. They could be oversampling folks with lower socioeconomic status. They could be oversampling different racial or ethnic communities. But they really have brought that kind of lens to the work that they do as well. At Pew Research Center, this has been, we don't really talk about it much, kind of I want to talk about it today. This has been a profound shift for us. When I came to Pew 7 years ago, we just did cross-sectional work. Now we've got our own panels, we've got more control and flexibility, ability to really design each survey to tailor it exactly to our research needs. We've got more control over this. And so if I look at the work my colleagues have done just in like the past 12 months, we've done multiple oversamples of Latino adults, Black adults, Asian adults, LGBT community, young adults, parents, all with the desire to do better research with those populations and to make sure that those voices are present and represented in the reporting that we're doing. So oversampling is one tool, probably the most, for those researchers who are able to do this, the most popular tool. A different approach that we've done at Pew Research Center that's part of this conversation, I think somebody alluded to it earlier today, is just doing a real deep dive specific to a population, whether it be Asian Americans, Jewish Americans, Muslim Americans, etc. So we have on occasion gotten the resources to do, a national survey with these types of populations. And it's a non-trivial thing because we're talking about populations where the incidence is often in the low single digits. So it takes millions of dollars to do the screening required to get large sample sizes if you're using probability-based methods. So that's one line of work that I've been very involved in and have really enjoyed in my time at Pew Research Center. And that's sort of another way that we're trying to change this conversation and be more inclusive with survey research. And we're doing it more also as well with Latino adults or Black adults. It's a little bit of a different methodological conversation because they're less rare. There you're looking at population incidences, between like 12 to 16% of the population. So it's less rare. You can actually leverage some of the existing panels that are out there or other methodologies. You don't necessarily have to just sort of start from scratch and do a screening. Okay, another trend that I'm seeing get some momentum is more diversity within survey organizations. So right now, my first point was sort of the lens was to the population that we're studying, and now I want to sort of turn the lens around and talk a little bit about the people doing the research. And this morning, Professor Wilson really distilled this, and I can't say it better than he did. He said the people who are impacted need to be doing the science. And so that's what this is about. And I want to be very clear here. I think that the public opinion and the survey profession is sort of toward the beginning of this journey. I'm seeing signs of real progress and change for the better, but this is not a sort of mission accomplished situation. Like we're just starting to build momentum in this direction. And I'll just give you an example of how this looked where I work. Back in 2012, we spent millions of dollars doing at the time what we thought was a really good deep dive national survey of the Asian American population. But we had real blind spots. If you look at the research team that worked on that study, there was not really strong representation of the Asian American community with the people writing the questions, analyzing the data, and reporting the results. And if you fast forward to 2020, we look back on that and we see all the mistakes that we made, like all the areas for improvement and the things that we really wanted to change. And so if you look at the reporting that we put out this summer, I'm much more proud of it. We've got, we made some real changes to our staff, our colleagues who we're working with, who's in the room when we're designing these studies and writing the questions. So again, we're not perfect, not at the end of the journey, but there is some progress being made. Another place where I've seen no progress is Gallup. They created a whole center that's devoted to studying the experiences of Black Americans, and if you check out their leadership, it's a very, accomplished, credible leadership. And there's just some really nice signs of progress being made in the field. And there's other organizations that one could bring that conversation as well. Those are just sort of two that I'm most familiar with. Okay, The next trend I wanted to put a spotlight on is sort of taking this conversation to the next level. I began talking about how with an oversample, you can get a population or subpopulation over that threshold from like not reportable to at least reportable, where they can you can put out data, put out information, and start trying to tell their story. The next level, though, is to get a large enough sample size with a group like that that you can actually look at variation within that population, right? So what I'm showing you now is sort of the old approach, the traditional, very limited approach. Like if you just open up any press release from a polling organization this week, you'd probably find a chart like this. And the limitation that I want to highlight is that, yes, there's data for white Americans, black Americans, and Hispanics, but there's just sort of like one number for those groups. They're treated like everyone in that group is lumped in together, and here's the data for that. But we know that it's a real fallacy that everybody within those groups is the same. There's tremendous diversity within each of those populations, and that gets glossed over, right, if we can only look at it from sort of a top line level. So that's one limitation that you see in a lot of polling. What we're trying to do more and more of is, again, to design studies where we have a large enough sample that we can look at important diversity within those groups. So we did a study last year where it was critical to my colleagues that said, we got to have enough cases that we can report separately, not just on Black adults overall, but those who were born in the U.S. versus those who came from Africa versus those who came from the Caribbean. Because you know what? Attitudes and experiences can be very different depending on your background and sort of your ancestry, where you're coming from. And so our new reporting, you can't do this all the time, but again, we're doing more of it, is you're seeing that sort of diversity in the population like that. Could also do something similar with Latinos. So about every other year, we do a very large survey of the Latino population. And again, the goal is to get beyond treating that group as a monolith, because we know they're not a monolith. There's really important regional variation. There's really important, sort of socioeconomic variation, and so forth. So we really think it's better if we can do a study and we can break out views of Latinos by age, by gender, by years in the U.S., all these different dimensions that really shed more light on what's going on in that population and get away from this sort of, fallacy that there's just sort of one Hispanic or one Latino public opinion out there. And probably my favorite studies that I've worked on are of Muslim Americans, because they're so rare, and it's just a real challenge to get a large national sample with them. But we've been able to do that on 2 occasions so far. And because it's almost impossible to go out there and find public opinion data for Muslims in the United States. They're just that rare. It's that much of a polling challenge. But we went out and surveyed over 1,000. And so not only can you put out overall numbers from Muslim Americans, but you can look at attitudinal differences by, again, ancestry, marital status, and religious tradition within the Muslim faith, whether it's Sunni or Shiite or something else. So, again, I've seen a real sort of push and energy around doing more of this type of reporting and less of the sort of old school cuts that you get of just a cross-section of the U.S. public. Okay, so those were sort of the most positive things that I had to say, some early signs of what I think is really good, important progress. But I also want to balance that out a little bit with some of the challenges that I see cropping up in the field and some of the things that I think it'll be important for folks like us to be grappling with over the next 5 to 10 years. And so this first point hits really on what Sunshine was talking about earlier, which is data quality issues. Because as we all know, there's been a real migration to online opt-in surveys. And for a lot of use cases, that's totally fine and that makes sense. But there are data quality issues in particular that can be acute using online opt-in surveys. And the problem that I'm not sure everyone is aware of is that those issues tend to be even more acute the more rare the population you are trying to study using those methodologies. And a lot of it's driven by what Sunshine talked about, where you have people who do not in fact belong to a particular population, claim that they do, and really undermine and damage the results. So it's a really important threat. One example that I wanted to share with you guys comes from a new article in the Journal of Official Statistics. So there's, as far as I understand, a group of the Census Bureau who are working on the 2020 Census Attitude Survey. And from what I gather, these folks were tasked with doing cognitive interviews of measurements for that instrument, and they wanted them, they wanted their questions to perform as well as possible and to be able to make sense when they were asked of all groups across the U.S. population, right? And so part of that exercise meant doing cognitive interviews with English speakers, but also with Spanish speakers, to study different groups, but especially making sure that their questions worked with Latinos, especially Spanish-speaking Latinos. So they did several hundred cognitive interviews using online opt-in samples. But what they found was, pretty profound data quality problems. Over 70% of the data that they got back from the Spanish language cases was invalid, or I tend to use, garbage, or just not at all usable. They were not, sort of real credible responses to the questions that were posed. Another red flag in that study was that only about half of the Spanish language cases self-identified as Hispanic. And if you've done this type of research nationally, you know that that number should actually be close to 100%. Might not be 100%, but it should be very close. Like, if you're interviewing Spanish speakers in the U.S., the vast majority of the time you are talking to, someone from the Latino population. And so that was just further evidence that, if you go out and you buy online opt-in sample and you're unable to carefully, sort of address the data quality issues, you can encounter some real problems. And the part of this conversation that I've really been focused on, especially this year, is there is a diversity, equity, and inclusion aspect to this data quality conversation, because I've seen in 4 different popular online opt-in panels this phenomenon where the cases that are bogus are disproportionately and quite strikingly likely to tell you that they're Hispanic, in some cases Black adult as well. But the Hispanic thing in particular jumps out. So what I'm showing you here, we did a survey with an opt-in panel in February, over 500 responses, and we had a question to try to figure out if people were giving us honest data or not. And the question was, are you licensed to operate a nuclear submarine? Which, of course, almost no one in the population is, but nearly a quarter of the quote-unquote Hispanic cases said that they were. And so I want to be careful, because I'm not saying that Hispanics are more likely to give bogus data. I think that's a complete misread of the data. As far as I can tell, what this means is that there are bad actors, right? People who are gaming the system or really not paying attention to the time. But there's these bad respondents, and they are prone to saying they're Hispanic even if they're not. right? And so if you care about doing good, high-quality research with these populations, that's a real problem. And again, it goes to Sunshine's point about fitness for use. And I also was interested in Sunshine's point about, is this the right question to be asking? I'd love to engage with that conversation in the future, because I've been doing some research in this area, but it does pose an interesting ethical question of what is the right way to sort of try to identify people who are really not, seriously engaging with the survey process without sort of crossing this line into ridiculousness. I think that's an important conversation people feel to have. So anyway, when I think about more research being done with these subpopulations, when I see researchers turning to online opt-in samples, I get very nervous for this reason. Another challenge, and this point is obvious to a lot of you guys, but while it's all well and good to want to be able to add over samples and do these large deep dives with special populations, they're incredibly expensive. We're talking millions and millions of dollars to do a single survey of a rare population where you have to screen out hundreds of thousands of households, especially if you want to administer the survey in multiple languages to try to cover that population as well as possible. So I mention it here because, I do think that there's a role for philanthropies, there's a role for people who work at government agencies that fund this type of research that, I think it's worth the money. I think these are good investments, but we really do need energy among people who have those large resources to make this possible. At Pew, we can do some of this ourselves with internal funds, but more and more, we can only do this type of study if my colleagues go out and raise $5 million, which we can't always do. So just making a pitch for investing resources to make this possible. All right, my next point is a little bit of a broader one, a little bit of a broader trend, but I think it's really important. And again, I think that there is a diversity, equity, and inclusion angle to it. So this point is about the fact that at least the polling industry, in general, we are very guilty of having lost the art of pre-testing our questions and making sure our questions are well written and comprehensible to the general public. And so the history here is that, 20 years ago, pretty much all of us were doing live phone surveys. And they had their flaws, to be sure, but one virtue of the live phone survey is that it was very straightforward and pretty well, adopted, very common. A night or two before you started your production survey, you would have the field house, the data collectors, go to 15, 20 sort of practice or pre-test interviews. And the PI would either listen in or they'd get the recordings back. And you would have an opportunity to hear how their questions landed with the general public, with 20 people sort of off the street, so to speak. And they would be able to hear if people understood what they were trying to ask, if there were words or terminology being used that was unfamiliar with people, if their questions were framed from a bias that was, or framed in a way that was sort of not intended and misconstrued. And there was a window to try to repair problems in questions. Then you think about what's happened over the last 20 years, though. We've had this mass migration to online surveys. And again, at least in the polling field, I can't think of a single online pollster that pre-tests their surveys today. I don't know a single one. I will give a shout out. I mean, there are still some researchers who do data collection online that pre-test, but it's really not many. And some folks, at the Census Bureau or some of the larger contractors are able to do this. But I'm just very concerned that as a profession, we've stopped doing pre-testing because our surveys are done online, right? So what happens is my colleagues will write their questions in the Word document, we review it, we send it to the data collection vendor, they program the survey, and then a couple of days later, we get back a nice, beautiful data set. And we have no idea that, question 3 just didn't work at all, or nobody understood what we meant by question 12. You just have no insight into that whatsoever. And so it's been my observation and my colleagues' observation that there's been a real damage that's been done here. But it's slow, right? It's the kind of thing of like a frog being boiled in the water. I'm not sure what the right metaphor is, but it's sort of a slow-moving thing. And I'm trying to call attention to it because I've seen a trend towards questions that are written at too high a level, questions that are written at a graduate or post-grad level, when the fact of the matter is about half the U.S. public only reads at about an 8th grade level. So we should really be writing our questions more at an 8th grade level. But because we've lost this art of pre-testing, that slipped. And so I also, again, I think that there is a diversity, equity, and inclusion angle to this, because I think that to the extent that we're writing suboptimal questions, it's going to be, the effect is going to, and the damage is going to be even larger when we're surveying populations that we might not be as close to. People whose experiences are even more different from our own. I think our blind spots to how we should be writing questions and the things that we should be asking, I think they're that much greater. So if we're going to do, I'm sort of committed that next time that we do a big deep dive with the rare population, we really do need to pre-test those questions first, even though the modes are going to be either paper or online. So we're working out with the vendor how we can reinsert pre-testing into our processes. What I'm showing you here is a screenshot of our early efforts to do that. We're working with SSRS, giving them the questions that we plan to administer on our online survey panel. We give them to this company in advance, they program the questions, then they recruit 15 to 20 people. And the way we're doing it now is they're doing sort of a Zoom meeting, where we've got a randomly recruited person from the public, and we have somebody from the survey vendor, and the participant is asked to look at the question on the screen, read it out loud, and answer out loud. And that way we can at least hear if they don't recognize a word, if they don't understand what we're saying, and we can sort of get more of that feedback that we used to get with phone pretesting. So my big problem with this right now is that it's time consuming, and a lot of my colleagues want to be doing more timely topical work, so it's a bit of an adjustment to work this into our workflows, but it's something I'm really committed to. I think this is something the field needs to address. The final trend I wanted to call attention to is to bring the data scientists here a little bit more into the conversation. One thing I'm increasingly doing at Pew Research Center is trying to brainstorm how we can leverage, complement survey research as well as computational social science. And we have not really cracked the code on this, but when I think about what computer scientists could bring to the table, there are a number of ways, right? So there are a number of topics that my colleagues and I really want to study well, but where the survey tool is extremely limited. And we know darn well that, we can go do a survey on that topic, but the survey data are going to, probably have some error to them. So, for example, trying to study what share of Americans actually support various forms of political violence, or believe in conspiracy theories, or hold different extremist viewpoints. What share of Americans use different news sources, and how often do we do that? We know that people are prone to over-report that type of thing. And, conversely, people are probably a little bit leery, even if it's self-administered, probably leery of reporting, that they subscribe to some more extreme viewpoints or subscribe to violence. We also really would like to better understand how different racial and ethnic and religious groups view each other. And I've never been satisfied with our ability to measure that with the survey. And similar with trust in institutions. We all know there's been a general decline with trust in institutions, but I am not sure how accurate survey data are on that topic, because it seems very likely that the lowest trust people, the most distrusting in the population, are not in our surveys in the first place, no matter how rigorously we try to recruit them. So those are, if you're a data scientist and you want to engage with public opinion, those are some real gaps that I feel we have as a profession, where if you could figure out how to try to address some of that question. You don't have to, nail it perfectly, but to make some contribution on these really important topics. I think the door's wide open, because we know surveys really do have their limits to studying that. So some closing thoughts. Again, I just reemphasize with the things I talked about in the first half of my talk. There's no mission accomplished banner behind me. I think the public opinion polling is at a very early stage, making progress on all those issues, but there are some real signs of encouragement, and so I wanted to sort of call attention to them and encourage more momentum in those areas. From a methods perspective, step one is sort of just doing what we can at the design stage to get various groups over that threshold to where you do have a reliable, reportable sample size. And step two, taking it to the next level, is getting that sample so large that you can even look at the important richness and diversity within that population. So these projects, they're expensive, there's a lot of challenges, but as a survey methodologist, I'm very excited to see sort of that shift in the conversation and greater attention to how surveys can be used, to cover the different attitudes and experiences in different pockets of the country. So I think that's about it. I'm happy to take questions from you.
Thank you, Courtney, also to program. You guys know this role, I know. Please ask your questions and allow them for us to thank you.
Very nice talk, Courtney. It sounds similar to small area or small domain estimation that we encounter. And there is a famous quotation by Fuller. It says, clients will always ask more than specify with a given state. So I wonder whether the researchers working on this rare population study, they thought of combining multiple sources of data, and there are so many data available. Are they considering that aspect of it?
That's a good question. So my reaction is I think that's a good idea. I would encourage people to do that. We have not gone down that road at Pew Research Center. My colleagues will tell you, because the outcomes that we are interested in, to our knowledge, that they don't exist in sort of disparate data sources that you can imagine bringing together. So, for example, when we study and do a national survey of the Muslim population, a big question on our mind these days is, have they had experiences of discrimination or threats and things like that? And I don't think that those data are available elsewhere. Similarly, like, what are their political attitudes or views on different social issues? I just don't know that those data exist. If they existed, then I think that would be a good approach. The one thing that comes to mind There is one group actually that I would highlight that I think they don't do exactly what you're saying, they come close, which is the researchers at Brandeis University. They've got a really talented team that studies the Jewish population, and they do, when they hear that there's a survey that asks about religious affiliation, because the survey could be anywhere in the U.S., it could be national, state level, city level. If it has survey data where Jewish folks were identified, they will take it and they will combine it with other surveys to produce really high quality domain estimation for that population. But I guess to my concern from the Pew Research Center lens is, I think that they primarily do that and produce estimates of population totals. But that's good, that's important, but it's not getting into the attitudes and experiences and some of those other concepts that we want to talk about as well. So I think that there is a role for that, but sometimes we have to, I think, gather the data
Thank you for that. I had a couple, maybe more of a comment than a question that I'd love to hear your reactions. There's two issues that I've encountered that you didn't mention that do feel like challenges. One is design effects. So what we have run into with the American National Election Study is wanting to get a large enough population of Black Americans to be able to say things with a reasonable margin of error, but an oversample is actually not the most effective way to go about it. That at least within the particular design that we're using and sample sizes, that it wasn't worth it to do an oversample because of the corresponding design effect. And so what I don't know, thankfully Wes did the calculations for us, but it would be nice if we had this kind of rule of thumb that we could, teach to our students or just have on the top of our head about where some of these trade-offs were when we're interested in subpopulations. So that's one issue. The other challenge is one of kind of data harmonization. So oftentimes when we want to compare across groups, the questions that we're asking, we want to ask in the same way, right? However, the particular concepts of interest might not be entirely comparable. So I'm thinking of measures like racial resistance or group identity measures and so on. And so again, it just seems like an area where we have sometimes weighed these various trade-offs of like on the one hand we'd like to ask this question exactly the same way for Latinos, but we're not sure that really that's appropriate given the theoretical construct. And just weighing those different issues is again something that I feel like we grapple with, but it would benefit from kind of larger conversations about these issues.
Thank you. Yeah, great point, Sunshine. I'm taking the second point first. All I can do is agree with the point. I have no solutions, but I share the pain. A lot of my colleagues want to understand race relations, racial resentments, and really accurately measure what's going on there. But I've just not been satisfied with the survey questions. We've looked at the AMES and at times done thermometer readings, but there's even an element where I told my colleagues you cannot use it because they were asking questions like, on a scale from 0 to 100, how warmly or coolly do you feel towards Muslims or Jews? And I just find that offensive. I can say it's 2022. That is just a really crass, frankly offensive measurement. There has to be a better way, but to my knowledge, no one's figured out what that really is. So I'm just sort of in a state of unsatisfied. I'd be interested in working with people on trying to improve that situation because we know that it's a real thing. We know that there are tensions and hostilities, and as social scientists, really kind of is incumbent upon us to try to measure that well, and I think we've fallen short. On the first point, design effects, yes, that is when we get the data back, where our first, emotion is elation, and then the second emotion is just sort of cringe when we do the weighting and we see the design effects. So it can take us months to weight as one of the studies that I highlighted to try to calibrate, reducing bias as much as possible by letting the weights do their thing, but also trying to not let the weights get too large, try to reduce the variance in the weights to bring down the design effect. Because at the end of the day, if you have gigantic standard errors, it's tough to, put out useful information. So yes, that is absolutely a huge challenge. The design effects, with oversamples, we haven't had quite as much of a challenge, but if it's a custom study of like the Muslim population and the Jewish population, the design effects are often 3, but it could be 4 or higher than that. So, I mean, to your point about how that's played out in the ANES, I am curious, because I think whether an oversample is worth it, I think it might depend on whether you're proposing to oversample a group like Black adults or Latinos, that you're naturally going to get a fair amount, right? You're naturally going to get several hundred. You're talking about 15% of the population versus proposing to oversample a group that's 1 or 2% of the population. So I think that might color our different experiences a little bit, but I'd have to run the numbers to be sure. But I think that might be why. But that's a good point. I didn't really mention there are limits to oversampling as a strategy, so that's a good one.
I was just curious. What was the purpose of asking that sort of big question? What was the purpose of finding out who's not telling the truth?
Yes, sorry, I didn't, I went too quickly through that. Right, so, just based on numbers you can get off Google in a second, the population incidence of people who are literally licensed to operate a U.S. submarine is 0.00%. It's a small fraction within like the U.S. Navy. So the idea is, let's ask a question in the survey where we know the answer, and the answer is no for really everybody. Because one of the things that we've seen trying to study data quality is that there's part of this bad respondent behavior profile is claiming yes, the positivity bias. So they're not just adding noise, they're not just usually responding at random. These respondents who are really causing havoc and are bogus, they have a strong propensity to say yes. And so if you have a question like that, that's one way to flag it. But I would also, again, second what Sunshine said earlier, there is no one sort of trap question. There's no one particular, one strategy that's a silver bullet in sort of triangulating to discern, high quality respondents giving you good, sincere data versus people who are really gaming the system. It's important to use multiple indicators to try to do that.
In the Latino population, has severe increased sociology, or violence, differences, children's respond to the above. Using one reason to dialogue, the problem or
It's a good question. I believe that the point was about how different there's different variations of Spanish being used in the United States depending on which community within the Latino population we're working with, and how does that affect survey research and our ability to reach them. Two thoughts on that. One is that the way that we do surveys now, nothing is spoken in form. We recruit with mailings, So we're talking about reading Spanish, which I think if it's well written can mitigate that to some extent. And the other thought is, I wouldn't say that we've eliminated this as an issue. I acknowledge it is an issue. The way that we try to cope with it as best we can is to rely on experts at the vendor, but then on a study like the National Survey of Latinos that we do, we have multiple people on staff in-house that will review the vendor translations with an eye toward that exact issue. Does this work for just, the Texan Latino population? Will it work in Florida? Will it work in Southern California? And they try to write the questions using phrases, using terminology where that's less of an issue. So that's how we try to address it, but I take your point that if challenges remain there, it could still be having a residual effect on who participates and to some extent how they answer the questions.
Ironically, my southern reading license recently expired. So, I
You would
think,
have that.
so I think one of the most important things that I take away today is something that's close and dear to my heart that you said, and it's the issue of pre-testing, and pre-testing specifically for online surveys. Most of what I've seen in recent years is most people on face validity passing it around other well-educated individuals, all decide among themselves in their well-educated way. This is like a reasonable question, and they never really get the chance to pre-test them adequately with the target population. And the other caveat to this is our liberal use of technology to randomize questions that we present to people, and never thinking about how the sequence of one question versus another might be able to impact on the subsequent response. So some more testing for both wording, cognitive type testing, as well as sequential testing of questions in the online survey, I think are important things to do. So I'm supporting what you say. I think you should say that more often.
Oh, thank you, Charles. And yeah, there's actually a sub-point in there that I didn't mention, which is when we go do the pre-testing, we have the vendors specifically make sure that they have a lot of folks with less formal education and folks who are politically conservative, because guess what? They're not terribly well represented on our staff. And that can be a blind spot when we're writing questions. And of course, we also make sure that we interview, have diversity with respect to race and ethnicity. But those are two, education and political ideology are ones that we hit particularly hard because, how you're staffed and who you are when we bring that to our question writing, we typically try not to. So, yeah, thank you for deciding that.
Yeah, I think, because I have a question in the second half of the first half of the asked, which is, how do you oversight? We're trying to worry about how do you oversight American Indians, because of Oklahoma, and the mixed American Indians running. Second question is, how do you define these things? What does it do? What is it Spanish? Spanish is different from Spain, doesn't include Portuguese speaking.
Yeah, great question. So second one first, how we define people, we let people define themselves. That's core to our philosophy. So we will ask you, what is your present, I forget what the question was, what is your religious affiliation these days, if anything? And there's 15, 20 different options. There's 3 flavors of unaffiliated, atheist, agnostic, nothing particular. So if somebody self-identifies, so that's the thing, the core is self-identification. If they tell us they're Jewish, they tell us they're Muslim, we believe them. Same with race, gender, and on that line. So that's how we approach that. And interestingly, one of the main contributions we've tried to make when we've studied the Jewish population and the Catholic population is that there is a lot of layers to those onions. Like there are people that are, of course, like Orthodox, and it's a really prominent part of their identity and their daily life. And there's other people that might have grown up in that faith, but they're really not practicing, or they switched faiths, or they're sort of culturally identified, but not in practice. We think that richness is what part of what we try to study. That there are different experiences of how faith sort of relates to their identity. So I think that there's a lot to unpack there. We try to ask it in a neutral way and take people at their word. How do we oversample? It depends whether, if it's a population where it's, roughly 5% incidence or higher. So if it's Latino population, Black adult population, we can, within our panel, we've got about 10,000 people nationally in our panel. If we're gonna, next month, my colleagues want to do a survey, so we might do a 2,000 person cross-section, a subsample of 2,000 of the 10, that's sort of like a stratified cross-section, and then we would just oversample that other group at a higher rate from within our own panel. So we just use a higher selection probability from within our panel. Completely different approach if it is, let's say the Muslim population. I only have about, I think, 80 or so in our panel. Just not enough to really work with. And so for that, we were looking at a completely fresh sample design, where we used to do it on the phone. So we would call hundreds of thousands of telephone numbers, disproportionately calling numbers in parts of the country where we knew the incidences were higher. And then we screen. Now we do sort of the same thing, but sampling from the residential address file from the Postal Service. So we'll identify, block groups or tracts where the incidence is highest, stratify, and then reach people through the mail and screen them by using the address.
I wanted to make a couple comments. One is regarding retesting, and it seems like there's a lot that can be learned from what the federal government is doing with cognitive testing in every survey pretty much. So I'm a little surprised to hear, that that's not standard already. And so that's one observation. And the other is that translations into Spanish. Spanish speakers in this country, depending on country of origin, will produce language differently. They might use different terms, particularly when using slang, but they all understand the Spanish from Univision and Telemundo. And that is the language we use when we translate for the overall Spanish population.
Thank you. Those are really good points. And you're right. I would absolutely applaud the folks in federal agencies that have been doing, that never stopped doing cognitive interviewing, knowing and pre-testing, knowing their tremendous importance. So glad you guys have held up the bar of good practice. And yes. And I think there's a lot of academics as well that have stopped pre-testing since they've gone and done the reflection online. So it's particularly a problem among pollsters, but I'm pretty sure we know that.
I have a couple of questions. Earlier, I don't know if you were here, I totally cracked all over the opt-in panels saying I worked at a company like that and I peeled back the onion and I saw the onion rotten. So I just wanted to say that before I ask you this next question, because it seems leading, but it's not. Did you answer your nuclear submarine question to a probability panel for comparison purposes? First, that's my first question. Second question is, and this was 30 years ago, so I don't remember exactly what it's called, but Norman Bradburn taught me a technique called added count or list experiment, where we could ask questions that were hard for people to honestly answer, like about drug use or criminal behavior or those types of things. And was wondering, do they not think that's valid anymore in a web approach?
Awesome question. Okay, so to the first one, have we done that work with probability-based panels? So I'm going to answer that at a high level. The answer is an emphatic yes. We've done that line of research with probability-based panels. It started with, we've got a POQ piece from 2021 where we did something like 3 different online opt-in panels, 2 probability-based panels, and then we had entered. And we did a lot of different indicators of bogus responding, looking at open-ends, looking at speeding, looking at whether people would volunteer if they don't even live in the U.S., even though they were, no, so we did a lot of different stuff. And the bottom line for that research is that the probability panels, about 1% in both of the ones that we tested, about 1% of the respondents gave us kind of garbage data. Tripped the flags that we had used to classify people in that way. And in the opt-in panels, it was between like 5 to 10%. So yes, we did. So I mean, even in a really rigorous survey, you're going to have a few people really flake out and not pay attention. So I do think it's important to include probability. For this submarine one in particular, we did not, because with the submarine one, I was trying to really dig into this phenomenon that the bogus responding is concentrated in people who say they're Hispanic or young. And that does not manifest at all in the probability-based panels. It's just, there's too few in the rigorous panels to see that effect, and you just don't have those people exhibiting this positivity bias. So we absolutely have included probability panels in that line of work. Oh, an item count. I was an item count hater probably like 5 to 10 years ago based on an analysis that the literature was really mixed. So it sounds great in theory, but then when various research teams have used it in practice, the results are more of a mixed bag, but we're desperate. I think as a field we're desperate. I had recently we went into the field in Russia right as the Ukraine invasion started, and we had like a Putin favorability question. And so it's like, are Russians going to give you an honest answer about their views on Putin when he literally the week before outlawed like criticism of what the government is doing? There are definitely situations where I'm actually more open to it these days than I used to be, just kind of out of desperation. But I'm a little concerned that it doesn't always work in practice. My colleagues at Pew did do it maybe 10, 15 years ago. They did an item count experiment, and the results were like in the opposite direction of what you would have thought based on sort of, a priori hypotheses. So kind of low confidence, but I think it should be on the table.
Great. I don't think I see any more hands up. If that is true, then I think we can thank Courtney, and we'll talk in the break about how many item count meters we know that have as a submarine items. Thank you very much for